Joe, Seb, would you just like to introduce yourselves briefly, and then we can crack on? Who should we start with?
Hello,
Joe?
everyone. Yeah, I'll go first, shall I? Yeah, so I'm Joe Giddings. I am UK Networks lead at Built by Nature. I'll introduce Built by Nature a little bit more in a second and kind of why we're doing what we're doing. But just on me, I suppose I'm just a bit of background. I'm an architect, and I met Seb. I know Seb through Architects Climate Action Network. So the two of us were very involved in, particularly in the kind of embodied carbon group of Architects Climate Action Network, kind of campaigning on issues around embodied carbon for years, and then kind of more recently have then been doing work specifically to do with timber and bio-based materials, which I'll get into in a second. Over to you, Seb.
Thanks, Joe. Hi, everyone. I'm Seb Laan Lomas. I'm an associate at Archetype Architects in the Hereford office. Yeah, it's great to get to share the room with Joe. As he said, we've had some great kind of collaboration in the past. And we're both kind of forging forward in the timber kind of question and challenge. I'll introduce a bit later on, but it's good to see you all here.
Cool. Cheers, guys. Just quickly, we haven't done one for a while, but I'm just going to put a poll live. It'd be good to know who's on the call in terms of which role that you actually have within the built environment. So yeah, I'll leave that up for a little while because the guys are interested to hear who does what. But yeah, Joe, we hand over to you?
Thank you. Yes, I will just share my screen.
I'll just turn my phone off.
I haven't used Zoom in a while, sorry.
Right.
Yeah, so I'll be talking for probably about 10 to 15 minutes. So yeah, the topic of this webinar is fire and timber. I'm going to start out just talking a bit about timber and actually why timber, just to kind of set the scene and kind of frame the conversation, specifically through the lens of Built by Nature. I'll just introduce Built by Nature briefly first and kind of why we do what we do, and then I'll talk about two of our projects that we've provided grant funding to, which are specifically on the topic of fire. So yeah, I want to start with I suppose just a bit of framing about the climate crisis. I mean, there's two numbers on your screen there. And I think these are really, really important metrics for all of us to understand and to think about in the built environment. And the one on the left, 424, that's kind of parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That was actually at the high point in May this year. Every year it kind of fluctuates a little bit, but it's steadily increasing. It's still not coming down. In fact, we're still emitting more and more every year. When I was born in 1989, it was around about 350. So it's gone up considerably in my short life, and I expect it will go up considerably more as well. I think this is a really important metric for us to keep in mind, because the more that goes up, the more warming we have. And until we actually get below net zero, it will stay high. So net zero really is just the turning point. We need to go further than that, and we need to get that number there back down, I would say, to kind of sustainable levels, something more like what it was in the kind of mid 20th century. But that's going to take a gargantuan effort from humanity and a complete rewiring of society, and an increased use of timber and other bio-based materials, which I'll get onto in a second. I just firstly want to talk about the number on the right-hand side of the screen. So that's 9.3 kilograms of CO2 per meter square. That's a target which the you might have heard of the Science-Based Target Initiative. What they do is basically look at the remaining carbon budget between now and 2050 in order for us to kind of keep warming below 1.5. And they split that up between sectors, and they effectively set targets for different sectors based on what's remaining and what we need to do, what we need to build, for example, with regard to the built environment. And 9.3 kilograms of CO2 per meter square is the target that they set to the built environment for 2050, or it's what they suggest to the built environment. When specifically this one is for office buildings, actually. The targets vary slightly depending on typology. Residential is a bit less, actually. But it's a remarkable number, actually, because at the moment, you know, the very best buildings are achieving something like 400 kilograms of CO2 per meter square. So it's a extremely dramatic reduction in embodied carbon that we're looking at over the course of the next 27 years, which is a very short time frame. So really, what we have to achieve is extremely significant, and I think we need to completely rethink the way that we build our buildings. So that's just to kind of frame, I suppose. And then what then is Built by Nature, and what do we do? Well, Built by Nature is a non-profit, and we are specifically aiming to increase the use of timber and bio-based materials in construction. Our overarching kind of vision is for a built environment that works in closer unison with nature. So we really want to re-establish this relationship between our cities and our natural environments through the prism of materials. And yeah, for us, that means bio-based materials. And a lot of the work that we do is at the moment is specifically around timber. And that's for a number of reasons, but timber is really very market ready. It's basically a mainstream building material at this stage, and therefore it is ready to be scaled up for buildings of a significant size and complexity, which means that it can help us reduce the embodied carbon emissions of our buildings quite dramatically. But the other big power of bio-based materials is not only reducing embodied carbon, but it's storing carbon that was sequestered by the plants, and we can store that in our built environment for the lifetime of the products and the materials that we use. And this is called the kind of 3S framework, really. So it's about substituting high carbon intensive materials. But it's also about that sequestering, which forests do very well, but other products like hemp do even better. And then storing. Storing is a really crucial one for us to think about as well. It's there's a lot to unpack there about how long we leave our buildings standing, how long can we really guarantee that timber is staying stored, or the carbon is staying stored within our built environment. What happens at the end of life for timber? What happens to the carbon in that situation? There's a lot for us to think about there and to unpack. And what that really looks like, I think, I mean, I absolutely love this place. And this is Hook Park, for those of you that don't know it. It's a forest, it's a woodland down in Dorset, but it's specifically a productive woodland. It's got quite an interesting history that I want to just talk about very briefly. It's a woodland that's owned at the moment by the Architectural Association. So it's their woodland campus where students go out and they kind of use wood that comes from the forest, and they build all sorts of amazing structures that are spread out throughout the wood. But just after the war, it was completely clear-felled, World War II. It was clear-felled. The timber was used to reconstruct housing. There was a huge demand for housing post-World War II. And this whole landscape was, well, 90% of it was felled. So nothing that you see there was left standing, or very, very few trees. Since then, it's got a really interesting and really positive story, I think, into how we could really steward our landscapes. It was replanted, but as an incredibly species-rich woodland. It's actually increasing in the number of kind of tree species that they have there, and increasing in biodiversity. And that's because it's being very sensitively managed with the aim of this woodland being a biodiverse, species-rich woodland that is productive. So they thin the wood, and they use wood from this forest in structures, and they sell construction timber to the local context as well. So I think this sets out a really nice model for us for how we can kind of steward our landscapes and use the kind of the materials that we can gain from that in our built environment. The UK at the moment is one of the least wooded countries in Europe. There's only about 13% of our country covered in forests, so there's a lot for us to do, really. Where Built by Nature specifically is working is on the demand side. So we work with developers, investors, designers, asset owners, insurers, and cities in our network, and we aim to kind of bring everybody together into a coordinated network to overcome the challenges that the industry is facing when it comes to timber. And one of the primary challenges is, of course, fire in this country, or fire safety, or concerns around fire safety and the regulations. And really, this is a challenge which is experienced by everybody in our network equally. You are probably well aware of the kind of changing regulatory context over the last 6 years, but until 2017, we in the UK were building some of the kind of largest mass timber residential projects in the world. We have examples like Dalston Lane, which is a 10-story residential building in Hackney, which was designed by War Thistleton, and at the time was one of the largest mass timber structures in the world. Obviously, everything changed, necessarily so, I would add, after 2017, when Grenfell fire happened, and 72 people died, and it was largely, or not entirely, but largely to do with the materials that were used on the building, specifically on the kind of external facade of the building. The hammer after that, the regulatory hammer came down on the attribute of combustibility. The government had to act quite quickly, and what they did was to ban the use of combustible materials in the external wall of residential buildings over 18 meters. That's about 6 stories and above. So basically what that meant for timber was that in regulatory terms, it could not be used for the external walls of buildings over 18 meters. And that was how we were building our timber buildings back then. You would have large planes of CLT in the external wall, structural CLT, and following this ban, you could no longer build like that. The wider shockwaves that this sent throughout the industry were much more significant, actually. So it wasn't only residential buildings over 18 meters that were affected. It was a whole range of building typologies. Essentially, insurers were became very risk averse. Building approvers were suddenly kind of heightened. They had a heightened awareness to the risks of timber due to its combustibility, and that decision basically sent shockwaves through the whole of the UK industry. And for a while, it became quite difficult to insure timber buildings, and it still is quite difficult to build residential buildings, multi-story residential buildings using mass timber at any height, really. So what Built by Nature is doing through our network and through our grant fund is to target solution-oriented work which aims to overcome these kind of systemic challenges. So I've mentioned insurance and the difficulty of gaining insurance for developers for timber buildings. I've also mentioned fire, and I'm just going to talk briefly about a couple of projects here which aim to overcome those two challenges, aiming to make it easier to gain insurance for timber buildings, and also aiming to kind of reach some kind of consensus on what a fire-safe timber building looks like. This project is ongoing. It's the Commercial Timber Buildings Guidebook, and it aims to set out really what best practice large-scale commercial timber buildings look like and how you design them, how you build them, and how you manage them. It's being led by Elliott Wood, who are a structural engineering firm, but they are working together with a couple of other consultants, so War Thistleton Architects, Lignum, who are a kind of insurance consultancy for timber buildings, and then OFR, who are a very well-established kind of fire and risk consultancy, and they specialize in timber buildings as well. One of a number of practices that are very good at designing fire strategies for timber buildings. And crucially, I think, for this project, it's got the backing of a group of very large private developers who all want to build more with timber. So you can see some of them on screen, people like Landsec, Lend-Lease, British Land, Stanhope, Argent, very, very large kind of commercial developers that are seeking to build more with timber. So they've all backed this project with a bit of co-funding. The second element of this project, which I think is really interesting, is a process that OFR are going through at the moment. So they've gathered together 5 or 6 of the leading kind of fire engineering practices in the UK, and they are facilitating a discussion between them to try and reach a consensus of what a fire-safe office building looks like. So that includes other kind of commercial fire engineering practices, but also some of the leading academics in the country as well. So Jose Terrero from UCL and Luke Bisbee from Edinburgh as well. So they are inputting to this. So the ultimate aim of this really is to create a guidebook which within that has an agreed kind of approach for timber, for large scale timber. And that's really important, because one of the things that's been putting off insurers is the fact that the approach that's taken by different developers is always different. And so when an insurer receives a kind of design, a proposal, a scheme, they do not know how to understand at the moment what the best approach is. So what this project will do is set that out, and then hopefully achieve the kind of backing of the insurers as well.
What's the
similar project
timeline on that then, Joe? What's the timeline for the project?
So the design team are currently kind of writing the first draft of the guidebook, and the fire engineers are going through a series of meetings at the moment to kind of set out what they can agree on. The guidebook itself will hopefully be published in kind of Q2 next year, beginning of the summer, something like that. We're expecting a first draft around now, actually, end of October. So yeah, hopefully next year that will be available to use. But I think the process of kind of getting agreement and kind of endorsement usually takes a bit longer than expected. And this project on screen actually is actually a very good example of that. I'll just talk very briefly about this. This is something that's just been published, actually. It's the new model building. So takes a very similar approach to the Commercial Timber Buildings Guidebook, but we're looking specifically at residential buildings here. This is an incredible amount of technical information, design guidance that's just been released by us. It's on our website, but it was developed by War Thistleton again, but with UCL, Gardner and Theobald, and Bura Happold. Crucially, what they've done here is they've engaged in a kind of process of pre-review with the NHBC. So NHBC are one of the leading kind of warranty providers for residential buildings in this country. And this process of pre-review or pre-assessment, they've taken this whole system through that kind of very lengthy engagement process with NHBC. And what it's resulted in is a letter of comfort from the NHBC that this system, if used, will facilitate developers, housing associations gaining insurance and warranty through NHBC, through their build mark warranty system. So all of the information is open source. It's available on our website, and effectively, or very simply, the way that the issue of kind of fire safety is dealt with is just by removing all combustibles from the external facade. So it's completely non-combustible external wall buildup. and all of the timber, the structural timber, which you can see in that kind of cutaway diagram there, all of that would need to be encapsulated with 2 layers of plasterboard, which is quite onerous. I think Seb would probably agree, but the reason that it takes this kind of belt and braces approach is just that really it's setting a kind of benchmark, I suppose, beyond which we can hopefully improve in the future. But this is effectively saying this is what all parties agree is a fire safe mass timber residential building. And in the future, hopefully we might be able to reach a point where we can begin to remove some of that encapsulation and expose the timber in all of its beauty. But I'll leave that up to the fire experts, I think. I think I'll leave it there. Hopefully we'll have time for questions about these projects specifically, but I think Seb is now going to dive into a bit more detail with some of his work.
Cheers, Joe.
Thank you very much, Joe.
I will stop sharing now.
Brilliant. Can you see my slides? Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much, Meshwek, for the invitation to come talk about this. So I'm wearing a number of hats within the construction industry. And at Archetype, we've currently been undertaking a lot of research around timber and navigating the challenges that Joe just introduced. As he very well said, like some of them were directly because of regulation, and then others were because of the shockwaves and the ramifications that sent around the wider industry. And as a representative of the design sector, we're obviously very aware of how powerful timber in construction can be at displacing those harmful emissions that Joe introduced. And we can only do that if we have the answers to those solutions and those barriers. And whilst there have been some really great efforts to date at challenging those, we know that a lot more has to be done still, and a lot more urgently. So I'm going to be talking about fire resistance, which is obviously just one component of the challenge around fire and construction and timber. But I've got to say the kind of challenge I'm talking about is universal across the whole of construction, across all the sector and all of the use types. And it's also a materially agnostic challenge. So I'm going to be talking about it through the lens of timber because it's a specific challenge and opportunity. But it doesn't actually matter what you build your building out of. A lot of the challenges that I'm going to talk about are prevalent. So this is me. Please reach out if you want to get in contact after this presentation. Archetype are very, very keen to help support others in the industry so that as many as possible can build using timber in a safe and performing way. I'm going to start with a bit of a positive reflection because I think it's really important to acknowledge that some really good work has been happening recently, and then going through why the rise of scrutiny happened. I'll gloss over that given Joe's introduction, and then talking about how as a design sector we need to and have been demonstrating fire resistance, and how we can safeguard timber as our material option moving forward. So just briefly, for those who aren't familiar with Archetype Architects, we're about 100 people now across our 3 studios in Edinburgh, Hereford and London, almost exclusively working on passive house buildings and schools and homes. And historically and still to the day, almost all of our projects are bio-based inside to out. So timber frame, either be it a frame construction or mass timber, with bio-based insulation like cellulose, ideally local untreated timber cladding like some of the projects you can see in this photograph, or thatch, reed, and then natural bio-based plasters on the inside. So this is my provocation of the day, and I'm going to be giving my own personal commentary on this. I've got to say, you know, I'm an architect by training. I'm not qualified with regards to fire, but it's something that as a team we've been looking into. So I very much welcome any kind of questions or challenges after my presentation about knowledge base or anything like that. And I'm looking to learn from everybody in the industry, as I know you all are today. So some positive progress in the industry. Joe talked about this already. I really, really recommend you have a look at it if you haven't already. It's very, very well communicated, very accessible, and a really, really good solution to the challenge at the moment. As Joe said, it's unfortunate that we do have to be encapsulating timber at the moment, but it does at least enable us to displace other materials. So it's a solution for the time being, and hopefully moving forward, we can rely more on alternative strategies. And something else that Built by Nature have also supported recently is the wonderful mass timber insurance playbook. Again, if you haven't looked at this, I highly recommend it. It's authored by 2 experts from the insurance industry, and it maps against the rebus stages how design teams need to acknowledge the concerns of the insurance industry, and in the words of one of the authors, court the insurance market so that they can negotiate a reasonable insurance strategy for a project. And it was beta project by a mass timber school that even had quite a lot of exposed CLT, and they were able to secure insurance without a premium. Whilst before this playbook existed, they were not able to afford the insurance that they were being offered by the market. So it's really good to see this in the market, and I recommend trying to deploy it on your project. And also there has been some really great testing that has been undertaken in the last couple of years, the largest of which has been led by Arup. All of this information is available online. They've got a lot of academic papers which have studied how the CLT performed in the fires, including some videos, which I highly recommend watching from a designer's kind of just acknowledgement of the risks and challenges when using combustible materials. But it also positively demonstrated some really powerful successes from where encapsulation was used at preventing the combustion of the exposed surfaces. So I think it is absolutely right that the construction industry has been shaken to the core in the way that it was after the Grenfell tragedy. Joe very well explained the challenges that rippled through the industry that we're still challenged with. I think positively, the market now at least is in a better, the insurance market is in a better place than it was even 6 months ago, and that's really good. But it's still a significant challenge, and what I'm going to be talking about has really yet to be grappled by the construction industry, in my opinion. So those who work in construction, I know that half on the call today are architects. So you'll probably have first-hand experience of how challenging it is to get your hands on fire certificates when you're trying to design a project. And at Archetype, we've learned that these REI certificates or fire resistance certificates are highly, highly prescriptive. And when we've gone to project engineers to talk about the challenges with achieving like the FR rating that they've prescribed for the project, they're typically not willing to engage with us on design matters and how we're actually going to achieve those targets. And we've also found that suppliers and manufacturers can be very hesitant on disclosing the fire certificate information due to perceived concerns around intellectual property, for example. And we also know that the concrete and steel industry have had a head start on the timber industry with 50 years of really extensive fire testing investment, which has allowed them to do more extrapolation on the anticipated behavior in applicable scenarios. So this is kind of a bit of the context of the challenge that we've been dealing with as designers. And obviously, we've also had the Building Safety Act, which came into force this month. And as we all know, a really important component of that is the golden thread to help safeguard the continuity of our design intentions and information through the long processes that we always go through on our projects. However, in my opinion, that's predicated on the availability of robust data. And our research has unearthed that the industry really is a long way from currently being able to achieve that when it comes to fire performance and certification. And I've got a provocation really as to whether England and Wales building control aspire to currently stepping up to match the levels that we've seen in Scotland. with regards to scrutinizing this information. And I think only time will tell if they're going to do that, because Scotland is ahead of the game at the moment. So I'll briefly take you through our recent journey at Archetype, which was instigated by a project of ours in Scotland. It's a 2-story primary school, timber frame, bio-based composition all the way through, achieving Passive House certification. And building control asked to actually see the specific fire test certificates, not just relying on the statements from the suppliers, which we would normally forward with project packs that we've received from suppliers. And so we requested and reviewed the test certificates that were sent by the suppliers. And some of them didn't have them initially, and it took 6 months for them to send us certificates. And then when we did look at them, it was effectively opening Pandora's box. And so that I'll summarize the 18-month journey in the rest of these slides. And as a practice, we know that we still don't have all of the answers yet, and we're ongoing with our research. But at least we found a strategy for moving forward at the moment, which we're confident in. So at first, when we opened this can of worms, we thought we must have just been misreading the facts. But our findings have been confirmed. We went to everybody we knew in the construction industry and the timber industry and building control, government working groups, and our findings are correct. And it's alarming. But as I said, it's not just timber specific. These challenges do apply to if you're building out of light gauge steel or other construction materials, which is useful in one component, because it means clients can't just say, well, stop building out of timber and use another material. But it means that it really does threaten the whole construction industry. And we spoke to quite a lot of UK fire consultant experts, and we were really dismayed by the kind of engagement we got from some of them, which kind of echoed where the bar currently is within the construction industry, which, given the Grenfell tragedy, I think is just really not fit for purpose, given where we should have got to by now already, and where at least government and the public are calling for us to be at. So for those, so the kind of like traditional way in the UK industry at the moment is fire certificates come from furnace tests. And this is what the industry's relied on, and where our journey started. However, these can be highly, highly flawed in their typical application and deployment when it comes to a project. So the certificate's the result of a furnace test, like this photo shows. But few are actually able to obviously commission these when it comes to a project-specific solution or detail or build-up. So instead, as designers, we have to rely on the ones that have previously been commissioned, either by a project or most likely by suppliers and manufacturers. To commission one costs between £30,000 to £300,000, depending on how much monitoring you want to do. Come with significant lead times. And the largest rigs in the UK are currently limited to 3 meters, and the certificates cannot be extrapolated over 3 meters if, for example, it's a load-bearing wall, and if it's made out of different materials. So if you're using a certificate and it's over 3 meters and it's load-bearing, go and have a look, because it may well be beyond its applicable application. And there are lots of other kind of challenges as well. And they all come with a use-by date as well of 5 years, after which they expire and they should be reevaluated. The tests also rely on a standard temperature curve within the test chambers, and challengingly, the inclusion of a combustible material is an additional fuel source to the situation, which augments that temperature curve, which leads to added complexities about the fundamental concept of a furnace test. And as noted earlier, the certificates are highly, highly prescriptive. So they set out the total height that they can be used for, and also loading. So if you've got a domestic loading with like 12 kilonewtons per stud, and then you're trying to use it on a school or a commercial building where it might be 30 kilonewtons a stud, you can't do that. It's no longer working within the parameters of the certificate. It prescribes the arrangement of the build-up, so you can't change the order of any of the elements. It stipulates the dimensions of the components, And typically they're also product specific, so you wouldn't be able to swap from one manufacturer's product to another. They come with a use by date, and frequently we found they reference out of date standards that have, for example, like British standards that have no longer meant to be referred to. And to be able to understand all of these prescriptions, you actually need to have the original test certificate rather than just a guarantee from the manufacturer that it's going to be okay for your project. And we found it can be exceptionally challenging just to get that information from the supplier or the manufacturer. And sometimes they come with NDAs that we have to sign, which then means we can't share it with anyone else in the design team or the client. But there are some really good examples in the industry. So the STA has been undertaking extensive testing regimes on some build-ups, which is available to its members, which is really positive. And what the STA have done is, because they've actually undertaken a range of tests using lots of different suppliers, plasterboards, for example, they've actually got product agnostic certificates, which mean you can use that build up and you don't need to sign up at stage 2 or stage 3 as to who's going to be supplying your plasterboard. But those are much more expensive to commission, so in general they don't exist. So we've found that at the moment, in general, UK projects proceed on the basis of these certificates with all of these variations against these prescriptions, knowingly or not. And therefore, there's a huge amount of inherent risk which is being carried in projects. So if you've got those variations and you want to do something about them, one of the options is desktop assessments. And these are used to demonstrate the acceptability of those variations against the certificate or not. And in general, these are infrequently commissioned by project teams because firstly, your construction detail actually needs to be based on an original certificate, which means you also need that original certificate. The assessment is then done by a certified fire test lab, and it costs around £5,000 and 6 weeks per detail that you want to have a look at. And in Scotland on this project, they had 3 details that they wanted us to demonstrate. And also the findings are a qualitative judgment on variations. It's not calculation based. So you've still got inherent risk there, and they may or may not be accepted by building control authorities. And fundamentally, they are unable to address a few key variations. So it cannot comment on height changes. So if you're trying to build 4.5 meters or 5 meters, which might be like in your stairwell or a double height space or a ground floor in like any office building in London, it can't comment on that. And if you're changing the loading, it can't comment on that. So in our opinion, it doesn't offer a satisfactory resolution for a project. So those are 2 options which the industry does use. The second, not as frequently as the first, but there is an alternative school of thought, which I'll refer to as calculation-based. Some refer to it as one aspect of performance-based. And this uses real-world material properties and real-world fire test data. And guidance for doing this is offered via Eurocode 5 or the British Standard 1995 1.2. And it can avoid the need for commissioning any furnace testing, provided sufficient data exists. But there are also restrictions with the current applicability of Eurocode 5 in the UK. This is being revised at the moment. And that may restrict the acceptance of it by building control and your insurers. We found it to be okay, but just to note that. And there's an update of Eurocode 5 in the works at the moment, which is seeking to get greater acceptability of this standard within the UK. And importantly, it allows for iterative calculations during a project. So you can do the first calculation at stage 2 or stage 3, got your details, you know it's going to be okay. And then stage 4, maybe you're speaking with a subcontractor and they're suggesting that they want to change the order of something or change the material specification. You can rerun the test and see and demonstrate if that's going to be okay or not, which is hugely, hugely powerful. So it's a prevalent process on the continent, relatively new to the UK. Internally, we've developed this flowchart, which represents the different stages of how a model is created to represent the original test data, known as the validation process. And then the model is then amended to represent the design intent, what you're actually going to be doing. And that's known as the verification process. The calculations then demonstrate if the proposed proposal achieves the required REI durations, and also by what margins, which is quite important. And it can result in material generic solutions, which would allow you to swap out different supplied materials at a later stage, which we think is hugely beneficial to the industry and procurement processes. So we've now undertaken this process for the school that I mentioned. We're really satisfied by the outcomes of it and the robustness of it, as are the client and also building control. We're confident that we can efficiently implement this workflow on future projects. Interestingly, all of the details, which were typical details from all of our previous projects that we keep on developing, they were all demonstrated to overperform from a fire perspective by such margins that optimization could actually be possible to reduce the amount of materials that we're using while still surpassing the required fire resistance, which is really positive. And you wouldn't normally get that with a kind of a normal certificate route or a desktop assessment. And positively, our PI insurers are also happy with the workflow that we've developed, which is really, really good sign and obviously vital. A significant challenge at the moment is that there are limited professionals in the UK with sufficient expertise to do this, which is an industry bottleneck. We undertook a lot of interviews with UK fire experts, quite shocked by the findings and some of the feedback from them. So if you actually want to do this, look to the continent where they have more expertise and development in this approach. And this is a workflow that we also had to create to communicate to all of our design teams about how we're going to be implementing this. And we're also developing a similar one for working on retrofit projects. So we're really lucky to have found a satisfactory and robust process for all of our projects. We did not want to be another one of those companies which has to swap designing in timber to designing in concrete and steel for all of the reasons that Jay very eloquently put forward beforehand. But we know that we fully understand the issues of the certificates that present here, but few have really kind of got to grips with that in the industry. There aren't enough skilled professionals to deliver the calculation-based process that I've talked through, and also not every project can or will be able to fund the program allowances that this workflow required. It costed less than doing a furnace testing, but it did cost money and it did take time. So it's not going to be a nationwide solution in the imminent kind of nature. So these are fundamental threats to the whole industry that need to be addressed, but it could be an opportunity for the timber industry if it kind of it embraces these and kind of gets the information together to help the construction industry through this process, which ultimately is what the Building Safety Act is calling for. So as a reminder, the challenges I've explained are not just timber specific. That's really, really important to understand and take away from this. But if we don't deal with this, it may well be that more and more projects do move towards steel and concrete where more fire data does exist. And it's not just a challenge for structural timber either, but also harvested wood products like cellulose insulation, which we know are a massive opportunity for the retrofit emergency. So here are two really positive publications that you should definitely have a look at if you haven't. The top one is exceptionally extensive. It's effectively like a undergraduate in understanding fire and construction. It's been published by very great minds, so I highly recommend losing a couple of hours reading it. And through the many hats that we wear at Archetype, we're very aware of some of the really great work that has been happening in the timber industry to safeguard its use, but I still feel that not enough is happening, nor fast enough for really moving forward in the way that we need to.
And then Seb, when you talk about some of the other stakeholders and some of the other bodies that are doing the work, I believe there's a cross-party, all-party report that's gone out from the timber construction industry. Is it the Timber Construction Barriers and Solutions report? That is that something like that? Is that working in tandem with, say, for instance, new building, the new model building? So there seems to be different reports pretty much pushing the use case of timber coming from different entities and different bodies. Is that?
Yeah, so positively, a couple of I don't know if it was a year or a year and a half ago, there was a timber and construction kind of working group that was brought together by both by government parties, but also stakeholders from the timber industry. And it accepted that you have various government policies that are advocating for getting more timber in construction and for supporting forestry in the UK for loads and loads of reasons. And yet you had other policies which were prohibiting that, as Joe mentioned earlier, and others. And so there was a concerted effort to say, okay, well, let's get all the heads in one room.
Yeah.
How, where are all these mismatches? What does the government need to take responsibility for in addressing those? And what does the timber industry need to do and take responsibility for in order for addressing those? And also, what can we do together? Where do we need mutual support and alignment for kind of breaking those barriers and making it easier to get more timber safely into construction? So yeah, I think that working group and others are kind of going to be, there's a report that's been authored, I think, and then there's going to be another one that comes out, I think, end of this year or beginning of next year. But there is positive movement for sure. But from the conversations I've had with some people in those working groups, there's still not enough kind of action when it comes to fire certification, and it's a really niche challenge, and it's not an enjoyable thing to talk about, and a lot of people, quite understandably, it's challenging to engage with, and it's really convoluted, and people aren't talking about it enough. And my fear is we'll address the insurance industry, we'll address certain components of it, and this will still be a fundamental barrier and blockage to the deployment that everyone's actually trying to achieve, because we're looking at the other components of it.
So in that instance, and so say for instance, Joe, the projects that you've undertaken, you referenced the previously largest timber building in the UK, and I know General Projects have done a number as well in Clerkenwell, and they've got a couple of others on the go. So did they come about prior to the Building and Safety Act, so they didn't have to adhere to these sort of strict certificates, prescriptions, etc.?
So the prescriptions that I've talked about today have preceded the Building Safety Act. They've been there. It's just that Scotland have a more strict building control process than what we have currently had or historically had in England. And it was through working in Scotland that they scrutinized the available data and made us scrutinize it enough to find these fundamental issues and flaws. And from our understanding of it, that is just happening on most projects in the UK all the time. In England, and it's just not being picked up. And that's bad. That's inherent risk being carried through. And there's a lot of projects which are working outside of the allowable boundaries of how you're meant to apply a fire certificate to a project. It may well be that with the Building Safety Act, English building control starts asking the same questions as what Scotland do, fundamentally show us the fire certificate. If they start doing that, the challenges that we had on that one project will start happening overnight in every single project in England. And it will be a massive barrier to the construction industry, which is why I find it really, so unbelievable that it's not being talked about more and more understood. Everyone I've talked to about these challenges, they haven't acknowledged them, and they haven't got solutions to them on their projects yet.
So where does it leave us then going forward? Because promote mass adoption of timber, and it's, we've got this letter of comfort on the back of the new model building, which was been pre-assessed by the NHBC, and so that letter of comfort is doesn't even take into account everything that you've just been talking about. Then I
haven't yet reviewed all of the information that was published as part of that. So I know that that's been written by very good leading minds in the construction industry. So I'm not specifically talking about that. I think we should kind of look at that, and we should try and adopt it and follow it. I'm sure it's robust. I'm talking more about the general use of fire certificate information in other projects. But what can we do? Just this last 3 points. Firstly, government policies need to be aligned. That's what the Timber Working Group has been looking at. And there's a significant opportunity for either state-funded or joint state and construction industry for workflows. Firstly, on a data platform. So this screenshot is from dataholz.eu. It's an amazing resource that was commissioned by the German and Austrian governments to get more timber into construction. It has all of the information there. It's publicly available. We could have one for the timber industry. We could have one for the construction industry. It also has all the embodied carbon information and all of the thermal conductivity information, so you can use it for your passive house modeling as well. It's a fantastic resource. We don't have that in the UK. And secondly, should we have a state-funded fire testing program, which then would kind of drive the transparency of that information? It could mean that we actually have a testing rig bigger than 3 meters, which other countries have. And then also the state could prioritize the funding to the materials and solutions that it wants to have more of in the construction industry, which would then help prioritize those solutions which align with its policies for our decarbonisation. So those would be two really good steps. Okay. Anyway, I'll close there and we can move to questions.
Yeah, I was going to just sort of reference, why is the use of timber in the UK so low, but then we've obviously they're outlined many of the challenges there, and then also when it comes to the role of MMC and timber, obviously that seemed to be key, but that business model is struggling, isn't it, at the moment, with the likes of Ilk Homes, etc. So yeah, so there's, even on the smaller scale, who's going to be delivering it out? And Joe, I know you wrote an article in the Architectural Review calling for less demolition and obviously looking at how we can repurpose existing buildings, etc. And one of the other challenges there's just at a basic level, from what I can see, is that just the planning community is not aligned either, is it? Because in order to retrofit many buildings, the planning community wouldn't even allow it. I mean, so it's not joined up at all, is it? So, you're calling for mid-rise as a maximum, which all makes complete and utter sense. And even stop building and convert, stop building and convert and don't do anything beyond mid-rise. It's like, sounds amazing, but there's so many not only is there the challenges that Seb's just spoken about, it's just at every angle with planning, for instance, is sort of so that what sort of feedback did you get from that article? And then was there any positive suggestions there?
I got a lot of very reflective feedback on the article, because essentially it calls for a kind of wholesale transformation of the way that we approach buildings, and a lot of people, I think, read it and told me they found it very difficult. But on your point about retrofit and reusing existing building stock, I think actually there's a huge opportunity there for us as an industry to tie all of this stuff together. You mentioned actually you kind of suggested it could be tricky in terms of planning for retrofitting. I actually think the opposite. I think that I think you've seen a whole lot of problems recently with developers proposing to demolish existing buildings and replace them with something else. I mean, the most famous example is the Marks and Spencer's in Oxford Street that went all the way up to Michael Gove's office, and then Michael Gove kind of threw the whole thing out. So that has sent its own shockwaves through the development sector. Developers are now actively considering that as a possibility if they're proposing to demolish buildings, particularly in inner city locations. And I think a large part of that was actually the kind of heritage angle. So it's about tying together that kind of heritage narrative, reusing our existing buildings. And what timber can do is enable us to build a bit more on top. It's not the only material that can be used. If we're talking about vertically extending our existing buildings, you can do it with a steel frame, which is quite light as well. But what structural engineers have told me is that using timber often means that you could add maybe an extra floor. So we unlock opportunities, I think, there. And I think tying it back to the fire issue, a lot of the problem with building very large all timber office buildings, a lot of the, well, I wouldn't say it's problematic, but some people think it's problematic because in the event of a catastrophic fire, you might lose the whole kind of structure. If we're talking about reusing most of our existing building stock, actually often that is not built out of timber, it's concrete or steel. It's completely non-combustible up to whatever height the building is. Let's say it's a kind of 8-story building at the moment. You could comfortably add a few floors in timber on top of that and not get into any of the same kind of issues to do with insurance and fire approvals and things like that, because inherently the industry looks at those buildings as just being a bit more safe. So these projects are actually going on all over the place. I mean, there's loads in London, in Westminster and City of London, central London locations where vertical extensions are already taking place in timber. And I like to think of it as us storing a load of carbon on top of our existing built environment. Store as much as we can and just densify everything slightly.
No, that's good to hear. We have, well, as always, these sessions go really, really quickly. We've already got to 1 o'clock. So Tab Binding was on the call actually, and she's gonna, I haven't put it live yet, but she will be joining, she'll be joined by Jasper Mead, is it Wood Knowledge Wales and PYC. So they will be talking in on the 1st of November. So we'll continue discussion about timber. And yeah, I mean, it's a subject I'm interested in. We have actually had timber framed solutions guys on before as well, because, you know, I just, you know, love to be able to highlight what good work people are doing as well. So no, we've got to past 1 o'clock. There's a lot to take in there. This will be recorded. I'll upload this and the links that I've shared, and would you mind sharing your presentations as well, guys? And I can upload that to the note on Meshwork as well. But I really appreciate you taking the time. Appreciate everyone joining the call, and see you on the next one. Cheers, guys.
Thanks, Simon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you,
Simon.
Cheers.